Okay, hello, welcome to the lecture this week on digital culture, online sociality and friendship. And this week we have Dr. Akane Kanai joining us to talk about her research.
Hi,
hello.
Steve. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. So the lecture formation is going to just start with broadly introducing, I suppose, the ways that digital culture aligns with some of the stuff that's been in other parts of the course, introduce some of the research and concepts on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about attitudes towards popular culture as well. Then in the kind of last bit of the first half of the lecture, I'm going to very briefly introduce some important theoretical ideas about these changes. And in the second half of the lecture, Akane is going to talk about her own research about
my PhD research, which was to do with how young women were kind of making these blogs to make themselves relatable and understandable for each other. So that dealt with Tumblr as a microblogging platform, which is quite different to other social media platforms in that it really privileges anonymity, for example. So you look at the ways, well, one thing I was really interested in was how are these kind of senses of belonging and community being created in this kind of very anonymous environment. So that's what I'll be talking about.
Yeah, and so Akane's research is kind of very contemporary in the sense that some of the stuff I'm going to talk through in the first half of the lecture, I think already, even though some of it's only done in the last 10 years, is a little bit dated. Some of it treats the separation between the, IRL, in real life, and online world. This is separate, where we kind of have moved beyond that. Certainly, methodologically, research about online cultures have changed. There tended to be, I think, at the start, a bit of a kind of almost Frankfurt School-esque, ivory tower, elitist kind of thing about it, where today, almost like, subcultural studies, we have much more deep ethnography stuff going on that actually wants to understand the social relationships that are happening rather than kind of, I suppose, saying that it's all bad, moral panicky, because a lot of the early research was kind of like that. So I think this will be a good kind of lecture to kind of get an understanding of the quite rapid rise of internet studies.
Yes.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I think it's also important to note that just because something is 10 years old doesn't necessarily mean that it is dated. It means that the problem was sometimes with that research, and you have cleavages in the research, but some of the data research, which you can even see today in the thinking, posited the internet as something fundamentally new. So, it's easy to see how the internet's really changed our lives, so we can all fall into those patterns of thinking, wow, this is fundamentally new. And that was the problem with a lot of the older research, but you can see that trend today still as well. So a lot of the research that's useful tries to think through how digital media works in conjunction with existing patterns of sociality, existing structures, essentially how technology always works with the cultural as well. So try to look, I think, when you're examining older work as well as newer work, for those kinds of binary assumptions, which do feel kind of, I think, dated for people that are used to the internet, but,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Certainly, I suppose my parents seem to kind of still deal with that binary in the way that they deal with it, where I suppose generationally and with generations throughout the course.
Yeah.
There's a definitely kind of a more fish in water kind of
absolutely.
attitude towards it. Sure. Okay. So to begin with, there's some great readings in the extra readings to kind of go over some of this stuff that we're talking about. As you'll see, the work about digital spaces has come to kind of be seen as a kind of extension of the, there's no real separation between these two things. So that, the emergence of research about youth cultures and subcultures in particular has kind of started to take this on. Brady Robards, who's an Australian researcher, has been particularly prominent in this area. So certainly there's new dimensions. there's new kind of negotiations with notions of public and private space, and the negotiations between the global and the local. Online spaces are kind of, in essence, where these negotiations happen, in as much as anywhere else. And I think what's quite interesting about some of the research here, we start to think about the way that the notion of power and the architecture of space of these kind of internet spaces are new ways of thinking about how power works.
Yeah, absolutely. And, drawing on that earlier research, again, some of the problems that people have when they were thinking about the internet were all these claims to power, and, Steve will talk through this in a bit. But, the idea of the internet as a fundamentally new space, meaning that it's free from existing structures of power, whereas it's not really a useful way to think through the social spaces it facilitates.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A former PhD student of mine, Stephen Owen, I think did a particularly useful way of thinking about power and the internet, and Facebook in particular. I was lucky enough to supervise this project. Steve did work about how he argued through a Foucauldian perspective how Facebook was a particular interesting place to think about how people perform versions of themselves online. The way that they, maybe restrict photos going up there or try and block some people and not others, have a way of kind of controlling their kind of public face, I suppose. Steve argued through the Foucauldian notion of technology of the self in particular, that this was both a way of kind of, being free and being governed all at once in that Foucauldian sense. Foucault talks about the way that we are often governed through freedom. And, this relates in particular in a paper that he wrote out of some of that research, and in relating to some, I suppose, public moral panics, and we've looked at moral panics in the course quite a lot, about the kind of almost shaming of young people through their public faces, through things like MySpace and Facebook in particular in the research in that area. So here you have these kind of life after social networking discourses. Barack Obama once said you need to be very careful what you post on Facebook because it's there forever. CEOs of things like Google said that hopefully one day maybe we'll even have to change our names at a certain point to kind of hide all the stuff that we did when we were young and stupid and all that kind of stuff, right? So you can see here how there's kind of, in some ways, a discursive pressure to be good online, to project a kind of employable version of yourself. And certainly there's lots of evidence that kind of talks about particularly high professional jobs where in America in particular, where labour laws are a little bit more lax, where they're demanding actual individuals' passwords to their Facebook accounts, not just asking to see them, but asking for the actual passwords to have a look what the person has kind of been hiding. So there's some obvious truth to this kind of stuff, but as we've been looking at in moral panic theory, it tends to kind of be a smokescreen, I think, for the real issues that are going on in young people's lives. So that's not to say there aren't real world, I suppose, consequences for having a photo of you smoking a bong or something. That can have consequences. But I think we're coming to understand that not so much, right?
There's also the issue that when you put this pressure on young people, but that it gives no responsibility to the social media platforms that orchestrate it so that you're supposed to overshare. The fundamental structure of these platforms is to share stuff that is personal and not just completely professional, etc. And so we just end up focusing all this responsibility onto young people and people in general to both overshare but also be professional about it. It's very diverse.
It's interesting in terms of the notion of being professional, right? Because academics are now increasingly encouraged and almost put pressure on to be active online. So on Twitter in particular, and I really struggle with that, right? Because I actually find the performance of self by many of the academics online to be this kind of overly moral, overly political version of themselves, and I've had beers with these people. They're not always like that, right? So there's this kind of professional performance of self that I think is inauthentic, that I find really annoying. And it's almost like the kind of opposite end of the scale of that moral panic in a way, where people are performing a particular stylized, moral, ethical version of self that yeah, as I said.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's increasingly compulsory. I mean, if you are a researcher that's into digital media, it would look profoundly bizarre to everyone if you weren't on Twitter. And yet, personally, I don't really enjoy tweeting at all. So
which again, I'd imagine has really interesting problems arise in terms of method, in terms of insider, outsider, and all that kind of stuff as well. So, okay. Now, I'm glad you kind of started talking about the platforms there. And there's some interesting work around the notion that, people are always trying to find a new name for capitalism. And there's one book in particular starting to call platform capitalism, that much of the, I suppose, the economic growth is around these platforms like Twitter and YouTube and whatever. And so an interesting, I think, and in some ways dated because it was originally coined by Alvin Toffler in the 70s, the idea of the prosumer, where, and this also somewhat aligns to some of the work in the course I've been talking about in terms of immaterial and effective labour, which I think is a much better way to conceive of this stuff. But then the idea of prosumer, I think, is a nice, simple concept to think about how some of the work that we do online for profit, even though we're not getting paid for it. So this kind of, in a way, moves away from Marx's idea that, profit is basically done through the exploitation of labour, of paid labour. Here we're kind of doing free labour for these platforms where we kind of post our photos, make comments, write reviews. In the realm of reality television, now it's the idea that in some ways the consumer of the shows have a kind of influence on the narrative of the show by voting people out or commenting online or whatever. So this is the idea of the prosumer here, where there's both production and consumption going on at once in various actions and practices, I suppose. So I think this is a kind of nice, simple way to think about that stuff. And Facebook is a particularly interesting place, I think, for the idea of prosumption. And as is, many of these, much of what we kind of come to call Web 2.0, all those kind of sites is about users creating the content. The owners of the platforms provide the architecture to do stuff, and the only other thing they tend to provide after that is ads.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also, I think, important to note when you think of these platforms kind of corralling all this kind of content that we are creating as prosumers, is that it doesn't, it's not an easy divide. Well, it's not just that all prosumers are kind of exploited equally. It's sort of funny in this space as well, because those prosumers who tend to have the most kind of valuable connections, who are seen to be high net worth, for example, who are linked to particular forms of consumption, are going to be targeted and exploited more intensively. So their data is sort of more valuable to Facebook because, wants to sell our data to advertise in other kinds of groups. So it's interesting to see that, we are all kind of being exploited through, our prosumption, but that inequality still, it operates in an interesting way in that kind of space.
So can you give me a specific example of that? Do you mean like Instagram stars, like Insta kind of inspo kind of, lifestyle people that are getting paid but also posting, or do you mean more like particular celebrities, or do you mean like Trump on Twitter?
Well, you can see that very much in sort of whoever has kind of a valuable personal life is then able to monetize it more, on a platform like Instagram. But you can see
so in terms of the inequality there, you're talking about like just in a way elongates previous inequalities of like being attractive as a kind of high form of capital there.
Yes, absolutely. But you can also see in the way people might be targeted more intensively by advertisers and have more kind of sponsored content, etc., if they are seen to be people who will buy, essentially. So people, who don't have that kind of capital will not be targeted as intensively. So you might say that kind of, maybe that's a good thing, you might think, but it also means they're kind of being left out of the circuit of capital in a way, the circuit of value. So, it creates other kinds of interesting inequalities, this type of, I guess,
algorithmic
monetization.
inequality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Because that's interesting, you can only kind of, for me, only think about my own behaviour online here, that algorithms aren't great at giving me the ads that I stuff with my taste, because I use social media in a particularly passive way.
Yeah.
And so it tends to only advertise things to me things that I've already bought.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting the way that algorithm, in a way, is making kind of giving human quality to the algorithm. It makes assumptions about you.
Yeah.
And almost compartmentalizes you on your online behaviour, where you could be performing a version of yourself online that isn't like your own consumption practices.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of affordances going on there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And same too with Google, things like Google Maps. Like, anytime I travel anywhere, it says it's going to take 22 minutes to walk there, but it only takes me like 12. So it's like, the accuracy in this is built into kind of an average, and the data therefore doesn't necessarily represent your own kind of use itself.
Yeah, and you're encouraged to customize it so it fits you as accurately as possible.
Yeah.
But this is why I never get rid of ads that annoy me generally.
Okay, so so the idea of the prosumer there, I think, is quite interesting. I also think, as I said, that I think the work on effective and free labour that I've looked at elsewhere in the course, when I was talking about bar work and the work that Julia and Dave and I have done, is probably a more theoretically kind of in-depth and complex way of thinking about that stuff. The prosumer is a little bit simplistic, and there's a lot of critique about that going on at the moment as well. But it is, I think, a kind of nice, straightforward way to kind of think about this kind of new subjectivity in a way that kind of online spaces provide us. As I said, youth cultures are certainly, online spaces where they're at. And there's some really great research about this kind of stuff. Again, Brady Robards' work in Australia has been quite useful here, along with his earlier stuff with Andy Bennett. More recently, he's been doing work with Sian Lincoln in Liverpool, in England, about private spaces and youth culture. Again, here they've tried to, in a way, cross that original subcultural kind of inequality, really, where subcultures are things that happen in public space and they tended to be male. Females were left with a kind of secondary position, often, not very active, and it kind of left out all the kind of stuff that, young youth culture was going on in the home and that kind of thing. So that research as well has been really interesting. As their work and others points out, again, there's a lot of just kind of, in a way, new ways of doing old stuff. Hanging out, talking, shopping, negotiating relationships, finding out about stuff, liking bands, finding a book that you like. All this stuff kind of always happened in a way that these spaces are just kind of new ways that facilitate that, I suppose. So definitely the idea of hanging out, I think, is interesting. There's stuff about digital traces, the way that people move from one platform for another as they come and go and all that kind of stuff, So yeah, I think if you're interested in that, Brady's work in particular takes a neo-tribal point of view, criticises the subcultural point of view a little bit, but uses those concepts to think about those online spaces. Another thing I wanted to touch upon before we get into Akane's work is, I suppose, the changes that digital cultures, and not just kind of the internet here, but technologies in general, the ability to, record your own music at home, or take recordings and cut them up and all that kind of stuff that's been facilitated by new technologies, has seen aspects of popular culture change in some ways, but I suppose also remain the same a lot as well. So there was work in the kind of early 2000s about how pop culture was increasingly dominated by irony and by kind of cut-ups and by reappropriation of things, by remixing. And there was a lot of, again, old moral panic about this, about how young people today are not original, they're not being creative, all they're doing is kind of taking old stuff and making it new by combining it with others. Now, of course, that completely ahistoricizes the fact that that's how creativity has always happened. The same baby boomers that are writing about, Gen Y being remix and not being original would probably listen to the Rolling Stones in the 60s, who essentially were stealing riffs off blues musicians from the 30s. So this kind of reappropriation has been constantly happening. And again, anytime you see this kind of generation mashup or whatever, again, referring back to the stuff in the course about moral panics and generations, I think you should be sus. But there's no doubt that there's been, new forms of pop culture come out around this kind of stuff. And what that also means is that there's been various creativities and various controversies around things like copyright in particular. So, I won't go to that. Yeah, so there's been a kind of move to the digital rights movement, and that's this idea that people should be largely free to be able to use stuff out there in the public sphere, that, owning a particular riff or a particular chord sequence or a particular sentence or whatever is increasingly ridiculous in a culture like this. And there's been various social movements to try and, I suppose, protect this form of creativity. So I've also posted here a documentary. Again, it's a little bit dated, I suppose, in some ways, but it discusses the problems around protecting, some artists over others, and the notion that copyright in particular is increasingly a dated idea. So again, I was just putting that in there for people that are interested in particular in pop music, and the ways that it develops and the ways that technologies both kind of drive those changes. So there's plenty of material there for you to check out. Also, there's been some really interesting work done all around the world, but I'm going to again focus on Australia here, about the way that online spaces kind of both change political practice, but also, I suppose, reinforce traditional forms of it as well. So Ariadne Bromman's work in Australia about young people in politics has been particularly prominent. Her early stuff was kind of engaging with moral panics about how young people are, apparently politically disinterested and vacuous and irresponsible and all that kind of stuff. I've got a paper on that as well that I think is in the reading list. But her new stuff kind of talks about how these new organisations that are largely, I suppose, presenting themselves through online spaces are increasingly having influence on politics and on, official party politics. So GetUp in particular is a kind of interesting example of that. It's not an official political party. Much of the data shows that young people aren't really interested in joining political parties, and in fact their membership is ever declining. But there seems to be more activity around these kind of forms of political organisation. So again, I'm just kind of pointing people in the course that are interested in politics in particular to that research. Now, the last thing I would briefly want to discuss before we move on to Akane's work is just some other conceptual and sociological theories about some of the social changes that are, if not completely, partly driven by the rise of information communication technologies. So firstly, there's I think the really prominent work of Manuel Castells. I think he may well still be the most cited theorist in communication studies. Castells' work has been really influential, thinking about how information itself, I suppose, has become the key product of capitalist society. So his huge, ridiculously large trilogy from the 90s called The Information Age and the Network Society traces these changes through from the 70s, 80s and 90s, where he argues that we've moved into a new era of capitalism, what he calls the Information Age. And there's a couple of forces going on here that are both complementary and contradictory. He says there's the kind of global restructuring of capitalism, and the technological revolution around those informational technologies have completely revolutionised the way capitalism works. The contradictory one is that as these kind of social changes drive more and more uncertainty, more and more precarity, which is kind of aligned somewhat with the work of Beck that we've been talking about in the course, it leaves people as kind of individuals to search for identity. And he argues that the rise of things like religious fundamentalism, nationalisms and things like that since the 90s have been a kind of symptom of that search for identity, where people look to the past for more secure forms of identity. They kind of become somewhat reactionary, and this is particularly people who are kind of left out or marginalised by these new social forces. So Castells' work in particular is been really influential there. He's got, like all kind of big social theorists, he tends to kind of, as new things happen, write new books about them and include them in his own kind of theoretical paradigm, I suppose. but his work in particular has been really interesting in terms of, and very influential in communication studies. Another prominent theorist here is Harmut Rosa, who talks about how these things are driving what he calls acceleration. He is the kind of, he engages with that kind of stereotype that life is getting faster and faster and faster. We have less time and all this kind of stuff. And Rosa is a key theorist of time. He argues that there's numerous ways of thinking about acceleration. There's technical, there's acceleration of social change, and the pace of life. And he talks about the way that these things happen, both through the rise of technologies, but also through changes in workplace, changes in kind of human relations and things like that. So again, Harmut Rosa there is someone interesting to look at in this area. And lastly is the figure of the cyborg, largely from the work of Donna Haraway. Haraway's argument, I'm going to very much simplify it here, is that the separation that we largely see between humans and technology is a kind of false binary in a way, that humans themselves, throughout development, throughout eras really, have increasingly incorporated technology into their lives and therefore into themselves. And Haraway argues that this sees human beings becoming more and more like the kind of science fiction figure of the cyborg, what she calls boundary creatures. So, very simply here, if you're wearing glasses, in Haraway's conception, you're a cyborg because you have a form of technology, on your body. You are then changing who you are and what you do and your abilities with those technologies. She's really interesting in this. She sees it kind of as both, almost like in a kind of semi-Foucauldian sense of governing through freedom. They offer us lots of kind of positive changes, but there are also ways of governing us as well. And some of her work has been kind of imported into feminist studies, particularly around the body and the kind of discourses of health and the way that body image issues lead to things like liposuction and stuff like that. So if you're interested in this concept, I've got some documentaries there if you have a look at. The one about Google Glasses I think is interesting, although Google Glasses now is seen as largely a failure, although it did kind of make a bit of a comeback there for a while. And there's other experiments about that going on. And there's also, been in the last year or two, lots of stuff around Elon Musk and his kind of argument that we need to be very careful of weaponized cyborgs taking over the world and all this kind of thing. So, again, these are kind of, sounds like science fiction, but, who knows what's going to happen in the future. So, there's lots of different theoretical ways of thinking about this kind of stuff. Again, I'm not going to go into this too much detail, but again, if you're interested in writing about these topics for your essay, there's a whole lot of perspectives here that you can check out. I suppose, I think most students now will be familiar with, in their third year course, with Baudrillard and Foucault and Deleuze. Mackenzie Walker's written about new class systems that are developing around this. Mark Durs has written about how, we now lead these media lives. I've spoken a little bit in the course about these new forms of labour. There's been some really interesting books come out over the past couple of years about how we live in this kind of notion of infinite distraction, that, online worlds set up these filter bubbles, that we're constantly updating to remain the same, that we live in an ecology of attention. I've spoken a little bit about platform capitalism, and a particularly influential notion is about this idea of effective publics, which is kind of, in some ways, where Akane's work kind of, I suppose, fits into all of these in a way, but particularly the notion of effect, I suppose, is quite useful here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to now let Akane take over a little bit and talk about her research.
Okay. Well, look, I think it's probably good to start off with talking about how, when we come across digital media or things that, that sort of captures our attention online, it's because we kind of have, drawing on that word on affect, an affective response. So I'll just say here that I've used different ways of thinking about affect, and you should know that it's kind of a broad and disputed term, but the way that I draw on it does think through emotion. think through feeling, think through attachments, because that's been used a lot in feminist media research, particularly in thinking through how media provides particular pleasures for people, how it promises to fulfill particular desires, and especially when you're thinking through identity as well in youth, the sense of belonging. I think it's quite a useful way to think about affect. And a really good book on that, which I think is quite practical in a sense. It's not on digital media, but that I think is quite good in thinking through things like belonging and identity, is the book by Margaret Wetherell, which is, I think it's called Affect and Emotion. But yeah, it's just a very sort of practical way to approach it. So,
and I really like that version of Affect as well. And it's actually, quite influenced by Bourdieu in a way. So she draws on Bourdieu as a way of kind of, in a way, socializing the notions of affect in a way, to kind of think about the ways that, uses habitus in a way to think about how some people are affected by things differently than others, how some people are effectively privileged. And I've been using her stuff in my own work as well.
Yeah, great. Particularly because it gives us a way of thinking through how emotion is negotiated. It's not just something that happens to us. We try and master it and use it. And we can see this very much in the production of digital culture. It's something where we think we aim to channel particular forms of feeling when we produce text or posts or that type of thing.
So can you talk a little bit about how emotions are social, not individual?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think sociologists tend to be very suspicious of psychology because often it relies on quite individualized ideas of how we feel. So the idea of thinking of emotion of how it's social is trying to look at the patterns through which feeling is produced, because we can see there are social divisions in how people are meant to feel in particular situations. So, for example, looking at sort of Bourdieu's work on class, we can see that, an embodied habitus will give rise to particular feelings when you feel a mismatch between your own experiences, understandings and background, and go into one that feels foreign. So, for example, a poor, this is an example from The Wire, but, a group of poor black kids going as a reward to a fine dining restaurant, for example. So from a middle class perspective, you would say, oh, that's a treat, that's fun, that's great, pleasurable. But, for those kids, it feels...
feels like symbolic violence.
Yeah, it's intimidating. So we can see there are patterns in how emotions are produced and how emotions tell us both they're a signal, as Hochschild talks about, so they signal to us our social location, but they also, when we produce them, I guess, give us a way of trying to fit into and relate to others in a particular way. And they're very key to the operations of contemporary capitalism, which, we've been talking mainly about digital media, but you can see in general contemporary capitalism is about the production of certain feelings, so branding is about attaching certain feelings to certain things. It's not so much about the product in and of itself. It's about, an identity-based feeling that you attach to a product.
And now work on effective labour in bars. Bars are not just about selling you a schooner or a gin and tonic. They're about a particular, attractive, effective atmosphere where people want to come and have a particular vibe and all that kind of thing.
So the vibe is very important.
Vibe, it's not the Castells version of the vibe. It's a different version of the vibe. And another way, because this relates to your own work as well, is like, so a way to think about this in terms of effect is humour is like very effective, affecting. But obviously, humour and the cultural economy of humour is based on, who you are and what you like, and, white people like racist jokes, right? And they think they're funny. So if you're in a social situation, the way that that humour can be affecting is that if you're not in on the joke, you're kind of not part of the group all of a sudden, and you are kind of cut out in a way in a certain social situation where people can almost seem to, like, if you're not part of the joke, you're using a different language or something, you're not ever quite sure what's going on. So again, this is a kind of form of symbolic violence in that sense through, humour. Someone might be making a joke about you and you might know about it or or whatever. So, yeah, that's the kind of effect we're talking about here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly, the people you're talking about use humour on their spaces to say stuff about the world and themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So, humour, I think that's a really good point. We tend to think of humour as something that's just good in kind of an apolitical sense, but we can see that because humour is so intimately tied up with identity and boundary drawing, that, we need to sort of inspect those claims a bit more carefully.
Yeah.
So the blogs that I looked at are humorous blogs. They're blogs that, produce little sort of everyday, moments of feeling through which young women portray themselves as relatable. So the idea is to narrate the self through kind of a general moment that applies to the self but could also be infinitely applicable to others. Yeah. So I'm interested in looking at, because, they circulate online, they're not in a face-to-face context, what kinds of knowledges and affective knowledges are required for people to be able to get those types of blogs and identify and relate to them.
Yeah. And so the everydayness here is important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So elsewhere in the course, I kind of use the figures of Hipsters and Bogan to talk, about humour and class and things, and lots of other things. In a way, they're not necessarily everyday in that sense. There's Hipsters and Bogans everywhere in pop culture, right? Or if you're walking around, you might see them everywhere. But what you're talking about here is not necessarily. The everydayness here is just like a mundane practice that people are doing, without even kind of thinking about it too much, are they? Aren't they? There's these kind of not thinking about it. I'm not trying to say that it's kind of silly or dumb or something. It's just kind of normal everyday thing that people do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the everydayness is a way to make a claim about belonging, and so it's a way of inviting people to relate to that experience.
Yep.
Of course, not everyone will. I think it's a key part to keep in mind, but it's a way of making a claim to generality or general applicability.
Yep.
Maybe I should show the blog now. So I was looking at a series of blogs, but they were all based on this one. So this started in about 2012. And so it's called What Should We Call Me? And it was started by two long-distance best friends, as they talked about in sort of subsequent interviews in Forbes and Allure and all these kinds of American women's publications. But this blog and its format was said to kind of speak to this subconscious of young women, something that all young women, obviously inverted commas, could relate to. But, this is the format. So you have the caption and the GIF. And the GIF is the punchline to the caption. So you get the moment by, being able to decode and decipher the GIF. So this is pretty self-explanatory. My life, I have no job, I have no credit, I have no underwear, So another term for these kinds of blogs, they've been called reaction GIF blogs, or so we can see that all of these posts are highly affective, so they're based around snapshots of feeling that are meant to be applicable to young women. So I'll just come back to this.
So are they ironic?
Ironic. I'm not sure, because so irony implies a distance from, a distance from the object that you're
yep.
talking about, and in a way, there could be considered ironic as a certain distance from the GIF, because you realise the GIF, it doesn't straightforwardly represent the person. You're supposed there's a distance there. So that operates in some of the situations, I think, but in others, it's less straightforward.
Okay, so maybe the better question would have been, is the GIF inherently ironic?
Yeah, I'm not sure either, because there's
as a text, how can it not? Seems to be always ironic.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think there is always that distance, but it seems to be embraced in sorts of different ways. So on Tumblr, like research by Alexander Cho, for example, he talks about queer affect and the endless looping of the GIF and how it's sort of non-linear and it interrupts straight time. And there's much more of, I think, an intimate identification with what's going on. But I do think, but the GIF, usually because it's always meant to, substitute into something else, there often is that sort of ironic distance at play.
Maybe my thoughts of the GIF is always ironic is more to do with my own generation and consumption and inability maybe not to consume the GIF as ironic.
Well, I mean,
so I'm not closely connected to the culture itself.
Yeah, it depends on the dominant practice that you're looking at, I think. Okay. Because there definitely is that element. So I think one thing we can see with the types of posts that are featured in the blog is that, there are unknown audiences out there. So, unlike, a group of, say, friends that and you're all together, who each other is, these kinds of artifacts are designed to spread to people you don't know. So in that case, it's quite interesting to think of when you don't know someone, how do you read what they're saying, essentially? And that requires position in a social location, familiarity with the kinds of cultural discourses they draw on. And that becomes really important because Boyd and Marwick talk about the context collapse of a lot of digital media. We don't really know who is reading our stuff, and on platforms, particularly things like Facebook, which Boyd and Marwick have looked at, and Twitter. I mean, you could have acquaintances, close friends reading it. You could also have your boss, distant relatives, people from school you didn't like, all those things. So it's quite challenging to know how to code this artifact that will spread in this kind of unknown way.
So I'll just relate that back. Most people listening to this would have done First Year Soccer 101, and in that we talk a little bit about encoding and decoding, right? So, and we talk about that about brands, so Nike can produce a shoe, and they can try and encode it with, coolness or athleticism, by using Jordan or Federer or whatever. But other people might decode it as sweatshop.
Absolutely.
So the same kind of analysis here happens with everything that we put out there on the world in these blogs and social media spaces.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that's a really good example because you can see the way in which a text can be interpreted differently, but it's not, that doesn't mean the text is absolutely free to be interpreted.
It's not a floating signal.
It depends on kind of the social location that you come from, and that itself is, that conforms to particular social patterns.
So there's a distinction of effect going on there.
Okay. Absolutely. So we can see then that things like memes are social spaces. So they spread with an awareness of group belonging, essentially. So people will read into it and then they'll have their own version of it, but it signals that they identify as part of a particular group. So this is relevant to the blogs that I was looking at because they spread as a meme. So the original blog became very famous, successful, and then we had all these other blogs based on What Should We Call Me, sometimes with a directly referential line, What Should Betches Call Me, for example. But they all spread showing a sense of group belonging. That's what I was curious about.
Okay. Can you give me a sense of numbers there? Like, so when you say successful, how many people were going to that blog?
Well, I think in the first year it was, they had about 1.2 million views a day, I think. But, I'm not sure of the views now. And it's hard to count. The last post I saw was late last year.
Right.
So, But you can see that, it was reported on in sort of various different circles. So that was, it was not Insta-famous, but, Tumblr famous.
So it broke away from the kind of, the Tumblr community and started reporting on into kind of mainstream, print media and stuff.
Absolutely. So we can see that if there's all these unknown, audience members or unknown readers of a meme, how do they have a sense of belonging? So I suggested that you require a set of knowledges, right, to engage with digital culture in that way. And what I found, there was an emphasis on knowledges of what is being called post-feminist media culture. So in a nutshell, so post-feminist culture both combines feminist and anti-feminist ideas in such a way as to suggest that feminism, you don't really need it on a collective basis, but it really prizes the appearance of strong women and girls. So you might see that a lot in a lot of media content. So any highly individualistic kind of representations of women, where they're represented as empowered, strong, but individually so, usually combined with an emphasis on a highly feminine performance agenda. So very feminine, usually slim, attractive, but still
middle
empowered.
Middle class professional.
Yes, exactly. This is
so
kind
Mamma
of
Mia is post-feminist?
Don't
answer that question. I think it is.
I would say Mia Friedman definitely espouses many tenets of post-feminist culture. Of course, its readers might view.
Yeah, but it's interpreted different ways, as there's controversies around it all the time.
But for sure, that kind of ideal subject that we've just described, that's very much, shorthand has been called kind of post-feminist, the ideal post-feminist subject.
So the sexual contract thing there. Can you just touch on that a little bit as well?
So this is McRobbie's work.
That kind of relates to the idea of feminine luminosities as well, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So she looks at the conditions under which young women may be visible and be, what she calls luminous, so lit up by light, I guess, which is a Deleuzian idea as well. But she looks at the conditions under which young women may appear, and she says, well, they can appear if they are sexually attractive, if they are successful, in education, if they are beautiful, and if they disavow any kinds of, collective obstacles to their flourishing. So they disavow things like class, race, so you get a kind. Yes, patriarchy is the probably most central thing. So you can see the way in which that produces a particular kind of visible girl, or what she calls the top girl. So
and I would just say too, this has some, I suppose, resonances with the work that I was talking about in the course around Beck and the notion of individualisation and things like that. I think, this isn't exactly the same thing, but it's kind of part of the same processes.
Absolutely. Okay. So so there's a big emphasis on freedom, but also within very narrow constraints for girls and young women. So we can see that when this translates in digital culture, there's a particular emphasis on who is allowed to tell the self in particular ways. So in post-feminist digital culture, you can see the emphasis on showing that you are valuable within those kinds of confines, those luminosities of the top girl. So we can see the way in which lifestyle bloggers who are highly visible and who are often young women, they tend to correspond to those particular traits. They demonstrate they're entrepreneurial, but they're reassuringly feminine, which is a key aspect of the top girl. So we can see that's amplified in many ways through social media, because we don't know who we're necessarily broadcasting to, but this is considered to be kind of the standard sort of commoditized femininity that seems to work. So some important work on that is done by Sarah Benet-Weiser, who talks about self-branding, but she talks about how often girls and young women are actually the ideal kind of interactive subjects. So they are kind of the pioneers of kind of branding personal life, interacting with people in ways that make them feel kind of, part of their brand. They build a social relationship as a brand. So this is quite gendered and sort of corresponds with the idea of the top girl as well.
Yep. So I'm reminded here of Anita Harris's work, really, about how, her work in the early 2000s about the can-do girl versus the at-risk girl. Definitely the post-feminist girl is a can-do girl, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's to do with saying that you can do it yourself. You don't need feminism. You can just do it yourself through your own gumption and your own ability.
Yep. Again, I suppose this aligns with a lot of other research that's been going on over the last 15 years, around the fact that, many younger women don't identify with the idea of feminism, but they identify with feminist ideals. So they don't like the label as much.
Yeah.
They don't call themselves feminists, but still, talk about the politics of equal pay and all that kind of stuff as being really important. So it's something here going on as well about the identity of the feminist has been rejected in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a strong premium placed on that individually being empowered, strong, and reading your own self-help books like Lean In, etc. to make it.
That's what I was thinking.
So it has a feminist feeling, which is important, affective capitalism.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily talk about the social structures through which we might achieve greater forms of equality.
And this seems to also relate to the historical generational debates of feminism as well, right? So there's different waves, and there seems to be always kind of generational conflict about how feminism should be done, where older feminists tend to tell the younger feminists that they're doing it wrong. And vice versa, and and then the younger ones say that you're irrelevant. So there's kind of this. I'm just trying to fit this kind of into a broader historical sociological picture here. Is that these kind of different ways of doing things tend to be fairly constant, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they relate to the current social, economic, cultural conditions.
Yes, they do. Obviously the economic conditions, under neoliberalism, that is obviously a key factor in why, we prize individuality so much and anti sort of collective struggle. But you can also see in that kind of identity conflict between, different ways of feminism, kind of a continued inability to sort of, this is, a contested argument, but to respect older women and the contributions that they have made. It's there's a real discomfort with acknowledging the gains or acknowledging, the contributions of older feminist figures. And we see this throughout the history of Western feminism from Mary Wollstonecraft to now. So, there's that continuing kind of problem.
Yep. Sorry, we're veered into your current research, so we need to get back to the new stuff.
To come back to this stuff, well, you can see that the feminist is almost a figure, right? It's a social figure that people recognise and might not identify with, but it's a way through which they can make claims about who they are. And so work on figures, so I'm drawn on the work of Imogen Tyler, but she talks about how a figure is a social type that people, tend to recognise, often over-determined, and they're imagined in excessive, distorted and caricatured ways. So this figure is not just about saying whether this figure is true or false, but in the Foucauldian sense, what does that figure do? How is that figure used? So if you look at the feminist as a figure and she's kind of repudiated, it's a way of making a claim about yourself and also talking about, social relations and how you fit in them.
So, and the figure of the feminist being rejected is kind of the 60s radical feminist, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The hairy, man-hating, bra-burning feminist. That's the figure of feminist that's being rejected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so even though it might represent no one, someone, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter because it's about making a claim about yourself in the way that it's used. So I've used figures a
little bit in the course as well about hipsters and Vogue and stuff.
Oh, great, cool. So so we can see that the figures are used very much in the blogs in order to make it, to make yourself relatable. So what I argue is that you can make a claim about yourself by first, there's a presumption that the reader is a kind of girlfriend that has a similar social location, and by that I mean generally Western, middle class, social location.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Yeah, that kind of, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the premise. That's the sort of genre. So, that's what's expected in the way readers engage with the text, but also in the way that certain figures are used to, make a claim about the self. So the figures that are invoked in the blogs, in the moments that are described, are people like the best friend. Even if you don't necessarily have a best friend that you relate to in this, very close, intimate way, people recognize the best friend as a normative social figure that a young woman ought to have if she's meant to be, legible.
Yep.
Yeah. So then you also figures like the other girls. So, I'm, normal, but other girls, obviously, they've got all these bad attributes, etc. Hot guys, creeps, the boyfriend. Yeah. So you can see with these kinds of figures, they're caricatures, obviously, but they're ways of talking about social relations. So we can see that, the way in which these masculine figures are produced don't really give space to talk about, they give limited ways to talk about sexism, for example. So either there's a hot guy whose attention you want because he's hot automatically, the boyfriend who shows you a significant, social capital because, he's your kind of heterosexual accessory. So creeps kind of appear, but they're never really talked about in depth. But there's a very sort of heterosexualized way in which all these masculine figures are produced. So
just to be clear here, the figures you're talking about here, the best friend, the other girl, the hot guy, the creep, the boyfriend, you, I suppose, categorize them out of the data, right? So you looked at, you were analyzing the blog, you were seeing what was going on, and then you kind of, I suppose, configured or compartmentalize some of the things going on to kind of notice that these figures were what the people were doing, right? And so that I just want to, this is a kind of methodology thing, I suppose, that the figures you're writing here are coming out of your data, right? These are what you're noticing that people are attaching some of the performance or the displays to these figures and using them as a kind of way of communicating, I suppose, with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess you might call it inductive, but I was looking at sifting through all these hundreds of posts from 6 blogs, one being the founder blog, and the other being others being the follower blogs, and looking at how were ways in which kind of the sense of belonging, intimacy were being created, and through the ways in which anecdotes or stories or feelings to do with the best friend or the other girl or whatever, how they were being used to say, oh, isn't it annoying when another, a girl, they weren't always called other girls, but, when a girl at a club steps her heel on your foot, or when a girl, but it also says, in terms of affect, says something about who we're allowed to express particular feelings towards. So the best friend was generally, always love, empathy, all those good kinds of feelings. There was no space for ambivalence. But other girls, they were sort of almost uniquely where annoyance was allowed to be expressed. So we could see generally a strong emphasis on positive feeling in the blog, sometimes frustration, annoyance, but in terms of outlets, the other girls were very notable for that.
So does other figures have similar emotions attached to them? Is the hot guy about lust, the creep about creepiness, and the boyfriend about security and status?
Well, it was interesting because the boyfriend was about status, but the best friend was almost more important.
Right.
Because if you show, and this is to do with, post-feminist culture, if you overtly show too much attachment to a boyfriend, then you could be considered a little bit dependent or weak, and that's kind of not really sayable. Yeah, so the boyfriend was more accessorialized in a way. But with the creep, it was funny because the way they were invoked was, creeps at the bar, or when you see a creep, but there was actually no description of what made them creepy. Okay. So, we know that sexual harassment is a very real thing, particularly in this kind of, in the age group of the people that were producing these blogs, college age.
Yeah.
We know that sexual harassment obviously is a thing,
Okay.
but yet there was no description attached to the creeps. It was almost though you could just tell someone was a creep. It was more a way of saying...
From the vibe. From the
vibe.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a way of saying hot guys and creeps. It was a way of making a claim about the discernment of the subject. So a way of saying, I'm sexually discerning. I can tell who's, a good person to lust up and who is kind of abject, is a boundary drawing.
So in terms of the effective economy of this, like I've just been kind of noticing this myself, the figures here too seem to me to correspond to, almost long-standing characters in like teen movies and stuff as well. Like I was thinking instantly of like Mean Girls and all the way back even to like Revenge of the Nerds. These seem to be almost like characters from popular culture that seem to be drawn into the way that people are talking about their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of funny because it's, told in a kind of self-representative way, but they're just told in such a generic way as well. And I think this is about, how the self is kind of, changed when you add sort of, when you put the self into a branding culture.
Yeah.
Which is facilitated through digital media because the self has to be more generic in order to be able to, appeal to many readers. It has to be capacious enough for people to fit in to your, to how you're, branding yourself.
Yeah.
So, even
so
though
it's kind of using the language of popular culture in a way to kind of to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
So this was a way in which, the sense of belonging. Was kind of created through these blog posts.
Okay.
Okay, so I talked about that. So just more broadly coming back to this idea of post-feminist media culture, there's been a lot of work on neoliberalism and the way neoliberalism, puts a lot of pressure on individuals to be entrepreneurial, very individualistic,
motivated, energetic.
Often those descriptions don't give a clear sense of the kind of social environment, right? Or even, some people have argued, this is a quote from Gil and Shah, almost entirely replace notions of the social or political, any idea of individuals subject to pressures, constraints, or influence from outside themselves. So I was quite interested in this idea because I thought, well, how do people actually operate? Because when people operate in, ordinary everyday life, they don't act as if they have no pressures, on themselves. How do you actually enact that type of individuality in a social environment?
Mm-hmm.
So thinking of this digital social space as a social environment, how are people actually grappling with those pressures?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so, well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question because when I see those GIFs, like, I see anxiety there. I see that one, in my life, I have no job, I have no credit. I see that as, like, again, I'm doing my own decoding here.
Yeah.
But that seems to me like an expression of anxiety about being this kind of, the can-do girl. Like, because it's impossible to be the can-do girl, right? You can't do it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there seems to be the humour driving a lot of this seems to be almost a recognition of the impossibility of that. And there's kind of, to me, when you've shown me these before, is like a kind of backstage revealment of the impossibility of that can-do girl, yet still, doing it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite...
It speaks to the irony that I was talking about before, that I find it hard not to see this as ironic in that sense.
Well, I think in a way, so there's kind of a claim about...
Go on, I was
distracted by Ariana Grande there. So there are lots of things that are kind of going on, I guess. But, the blogs are, I think, about acknowledging living under neoliberalism in a certain way.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a crafted vulnerability or something that is invoked because, we can all acknowledge in a way that, we have stresses in relation to work life, personal life, etc. But what these blogs I found were doing is that they articulate that kind of, frustration or anxiety or vulnerability, but because the ultimate format is a humorous blog, it acknowledges the stress only to quickly overcome it or to just briefly acknowledge it in order to move on so everyone can laugh.
So it's like a curated performance of anxiety.
Yeah. So, I'll just, I'll go from the current slide. So what we can see is that this is not to say, I'm not, making a claim that these feelings are not real, but I'm just, that people that these young women don't actually feel anxiety, pressures, etc. But in the way in which, they're kind of articulated in these little emotional snapshots in this highly general way, what you can kind of see from looking at, a number of them is that the self is made actually quite consistent and disciplined in the way emotion is related.
Yeah.
And that emotion is crafted in such a way that, it can be quite general. So it's not necessarily about the self. I mean, it's not too specific. So in one example from the blog that was quite early on when the blog started, you could see the posts were more kind of, what's the word? They're not more individual, but they related to a situation that wasn't generic.
Okay.
So, for example, if there was a post sort of articulating his fury at this girl in her class who didn't get this thing, but it wasn't even really clear what the thing was. It was like a mathematical equation or something like that. It was very specific, actually.
Yeah.
And she kind of moves away from that because, people don't want memes circulating that are horrendously, that can't be generalized, essentially. So we can see this generalizable self, but obviously that draws on particular sets of feelings that people want to experience. So
was that a result of the blog becoming more popular though, and maybe a pressure to be more generalised as the audience group?
Well, because I actually spoke to that blogger, and she did say that it just seemed to make more sense, and she did obviously gain more of an audience. When I spoke to her, I think she had about 3,000 followers.
Yeah.
But yeah, she talked about how, it was easier to do something a bit more general because it's going to make people laugh.
Yeah.
So there's this consistency, this kind of very disciplined way in which his emotions are produced, and to create the right emotional tone as well is, requires a lot of sophistication.
Yeah.
So it's, the tone is, I acknowledge that we all have issues and, concerns, but not too much because it's meant to be lighthearted. It's not meant to be a real downer on your day. So,
Okay. And so, what I think, just to return here to the everydayness of this, I think that notion is really important, and as a sociological concept, to consider this, because I think it'd be quite easy for someone to come along here and go, oh, this is just a person, doing stuff for the lols, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's maybe true. But the sociologist wants to actually show how important that mundanity is. That's what we do, and that's how we kind of construct ourselves, and how we kind of engage with others, how we want other people to think of us, and how we then relate to them. So again, I want to kind of accentuate here that the mundanity of these examples, I think, are what's particularly sociologically interesting about them.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just, like a theatre where you, perform a story of yourself for this audience on one occasion. It's almost, like often just the drama of everyday life. And, that's very much key to the way in which these blogs, I think, need to be interpreted.
Yep. We spoke a little bit about the humour already.
But in general, what we can see is the way in which becoming much more, well, these young women, but I think you can see as a general pattern, becoming much more skilled at reworking the complexity of ourselves into simpler and more consumable versions unknown audiences,
Yep.
and those tend to fit along particular lines that
Yep.
we consider to be good things about people.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
we discussed that in the post-feminist
Yep.
stuff. So how much time
Yeah, we've got a
do
couple
we
minutes,
have still? So the upshot of this was that I was, trying to speak to these debates about post-feminist culture and, the standard kind of figure of post-feminism being the top girl, the can-do girl, power girl. You kind of get what the theme there.
Yeah.
But, we're not all Sheryl Sandbergs, obviously, and we're not all performing that, in an everyday way. So what we can see is that type of environment is not just about being that person, like, fulfilling that subjectivity, but it gives us a set of feeling rules.
Yep.
So drawing on the work of Ali Hochschild, this is a set of rules about how we feel about ourselves, how we work on ourselves to better fit, the feelings that we're supposed to have, and gives us ways in which we relate to others.
Yep.
So, it might seem, when you look at these things, you might automatically or, presume, oh, it's so great, look at all these sort of humorous communities where we can all get together and just have a laugh and, relate to each other and have stuff in common with each other. But I think what you can also see is there are these layers in which we relate to each other. It's highly structured. If we are all kind of boiling ourselves down into these simpler versions of ourselves, disavowing, any major issues that we're having, and making ourselves relatable through these kind of stock figures that are very much, set through media and through different, patriarchal structures, then on what is that relatability premised? We need to really think, is that really good in and of itself, that sense of feeling and belonging? I mean, what underpins that, essentially?
Yeah. And can you actually feel like you belong to something like that? The notion of belonging there, I think it needs to be unpacked a bit more, because the belonging is ephemeral. It's constantly seems to be evolving. It's based on very specific symbols and codes.
Yeah.
So I think even people that feel like they know the codes and understand the symbols would constantly be on their toes in that situation to feel like they need to kind of fit in, and that notion of belonging then becomes maybe a form of cruel optimism in a way that Lauren Blount talks about, that I've spoken a little bit about in the course, where, this stuff that we kind of feel that we need and we're driven to need by others is actually the opposite to our flourishing.
Yeah.
Things like that. So this also does relate, I think, to wider notions of what's become known as happiness studies, and this idea that, we should be happy and we need to do things to be happy, which we increasingly know, many of those things are around material needs and status things that actually we know make us unhappy when we're kind of striving for them. So, I think that the work that you're doing here kind of, again, that everydayness of those examples kind of really speak into those kind of wider, sociological problems that have been investigated in all kinds of different ways. So I want to say too here that your empirical work on this, about these specific blogs, I think provides also a really almost a kind of conceptual and methodological way to think about most of this kind of activity. So this, in a way, what's going on there is a particular kind of taste community. I think you could bring into the methodology that you're using to kind of, I don't know, look at people that write blogs about cricket or write blogs about heavy metal music, and they tend to then have people like-minded, gathering around those things that have their own codes, that have their own jokes, that have their own symbols, and there'd be very similar social relations going on regardless of the actual taste or cultural practice, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is important when we're thinking through and, come back to our first discussion of affect, is to think about it in a structured way.
Yeah.
So not just to say it's just this energy that kind of flows through us and it's separate from meaning, to really think through the way it does structure what we do and how we do it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's just conclude. We covered a lot of ground here early on, and then so I just wanted to kind of come back to some of those things. Again, emphasize here that the the rise of internet studies doesn't kind of necessarily view the internet as kind of this separate social space away from the real world. Increasingly, we're embedded in media in our day-to-day lives, or vice versa. I'm not sure we've put the cart before the horse there, but that's an interesting problem in itself. So the research is really interesting in this sense, and so shows that, friendship and stuff like that is, been ever a thing that young people are involved or seeking out, and, these online spaces are just kind of, in a way, new ways of doing that old stuff that maybe was, happening behind our bike sheds or in the playground or whatever. It's kind of just a different space that stuff like that's going on. So what's also, I think, intriguing here in terms of the history of study of these spaces is that some of the early internet research was quite utopian in that there was this idea that, particularly when most of online activity back in the 90s was particularly anonymous, there was this idea that people would be free to perform the versions of themselves and have these avatars and stuff like that. There'd be a place, for everyone to get together. It was kind of like this global village. But it's, we seem to have developed much of our same social problems in these spaces as we've always had, so there seems to be this internet is essentially where much racism and sexism and classism and that kind of stuff happens. As I was kind of talking a little bit earlier on about the Twitter stuff, it seems that people want to have this performance and political self on there, but in their real life, day to day, they're probably not doing too much about, they're kind of. So there's again this kind of performance of selves that we've always done in different contexts, in that Goffman-esque sense that, you're a different person in front of your friends than your parents and stuff like that. There's still elements of that going on. I think, Goffman has been quite useful in the past, and he kind of seems to have gone out of internet studies a little bit now in terms of a key theorist, I suppose. But
I think he could come back. I think it's just the problem that the way he was being used by lots of people was quite
clunky.
Yes.
So I just wanted to, again, just talking about, the affordances of online stuff. Some people say that it allows us to be free and you can buy stuff whenever you want. Others would then describe it as digital panopticon. Here we're put to work more and more as consumers. We're not getting paid. So there's, again, very similar debates, I think, and very similar conceptual, theoretical issues going on that have always happened. And I think the online spaces and the digital stuff has been really interesting ways to think of that in a different ontological way. And so I'm emphasising here that I think definitely the best way to think about these things are no separation between IRL and online or whatever. And okay. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.